Recording has been started.
Good evening, everyone, especially folks here in the United States, and good morning for the person who's joining to present the seminar from India. Welcome to everyone to the seminar series under the Nanda Fellowship Training Program of the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. My name is Dr. Adityanjee, and I am the President of International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. I am also the Fellowship Training Director for the Professor Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights, a very unique fellowship training program. For those of you who are not aware, this is the logo of the ICHRRF, or International Commission. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the ICHRRF, I invite all our audience members to yet another seminar in the ICHRRF Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program. Our distinguished faculty includes Professor Ved P. Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, that is Dr. Adityanjee, Mr. Carl Clemens, Mr. Hardam Tripathi, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shendurnikar, and Dr. Richard Benkins. We have currently two fellows, Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, who is from January 2022 batch, and Anushree Ghisad, who is from the July 2022 batch. So our seminars have a very standard format. We have around 5 minutes of introduction, followed by 25 minutes of presentation by the fellow. Sometimes, depending on the topic, fellow is given more time. Usually there's a 10 minutes commentary by chief mentor of the fellowship program, which is Professor Ved Nanda. This is usually followed by 25 minutes of discussion by the faculty preceptor. And last 30 minutes are for question and answers. So the whole seminar is around 1 hour and 30 minutes with very equal spread for the presentation, commentary, and question and answer. We have a very interesting topic today. It may be interesting, but it is heart rendering. Traffic of persons and slavery in the WANA region. And of course, the fellow who is going to make presentation is Mrs. Anushree Ghisad, and I am the faculty preceptor. Before we actually start the fellowship seminar, there are a couple of announcements. We are going to have a distinguished lecture under our Speaking Up series by Professor Sen Nie. He will be speaking on Saturday, October 1st at 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime, and that is China's persecution of religious freedom, especially Falun Gong. So that is going to be a very, very educative, informational, and eye-opening lecture. Last month on August 28th, Sunday at 10 a.m., we released the special hearing report on Kashmiri Hindu genocide. This is available now on our website, and we are working towards getting it published in a book form. We are looking for applicants for January 2023 session of the fellowship training program, and we invite volunteer faculty to participate in this fellowship training program as faculty preceptors. So there are some housekeeping rules. Everyone should keep themselves on mute to avoid noise interference. Everyone should change their cell phone settings to vibration mode. Please do not try to interrupt when our fellow is making the presentation or faculty is making commentary. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to pose questions. Anonymous questioners are not encouraged. All the questions have to be asked through chat function. Please be very precise and specific in asking questions. Please don't send detailed comments in the form of a lecture or a monologue. And lastly, like all the seminars in Nanda Fellowship Training Program, this seminar is also being recorded. It will be available as an educational resource and reference material on our website in the form of a YouTube video. So as I said that Mrs. Anushree Ghisad would be making the presentation today. So without further ado, I invite Anushree to make her presentation, and I know she has been working very hard and she has an excellent PowerPoint presentation. Anushree, it's yours.
Adityanjee. Namaste everyone. Greetings to one and all. Please allow me to share my presentation. Can my presentation be seen?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Can it be seen better?
Yes.
In full screen mode?
Yes.
Okay. So today I would be speaking on this topic, which is trafficking in persons and slavery in WANA region. So this is the outline of my presentation. There are three major things I hope we could take away from this presentation. First, to understand trafficking in persons and its forms. Second, what are the peculiarities of human trafficking in WANA region? And third, why should it bother us? So we will begin with three stories, ostensibly unrelated stories that took place in three different regions on this globe. So beginning with the first story, it is story of a 55-year-old Tamil woman named Kasturi. Now Kasturi was the sole breadwinner of a family. She had to pay off a lot of family debt, and after her son's accident, she was very desperate to find work to make ends meet. So, through a local agent, she went to Saudi Arabia, where she was promised a monthly salary of around $180 with food and accommodation. Now, what actually happened with Kasturi when she reached Saudi? She was employed by a local Saudi family where she was subjected to abysmal working conditions. She was tortured, starved, and not allowed to rest at all. Due to all of this, she suffered a catalogue of abuse since taking up this post of domestic work. So, in her sister's words, Kasturi was not paid, she was barely given enough food to eat, and was not even allowed to speak to her family members. Her passport was taken, which made it very difficult for her to leave her country. So basically, she was frustrated and exhausted. And once she thought of complaining of her situation to a neighboring driver who was serving in a neighboring household, who was also Tamil, so he could speak Tamil. Now, upon realizing that Kasturi has launched a complaint, her employer came looking for her. That employer actually grabbed her by hand and dragged her home. That day, Kasturi's arm was chopped off by the employer. And what for? Because Kasturi was complaining about her conditions. Now, Kasturi, a woman in her mid-50s, fell and suffered serious spinal injuries because her hand was chopped off. Indian embassy in Riyadh managed to arrange for the medical help and bring her to India. So today, what is Kasturi's condition? She is rendered unemployed as she cannot work with one hand. So Indonesian government had banned migration of its citizens for domestic work in Saudi Arabia way back in 2011. And Kasturi would like government of India to do the same. In her own words, no one should go there, their meaning to Saudi Arabia. They all join together and they do the same thing. No one realizes their wrongdoing. Coming to second story, this is story of Aisha. And the name has been changed to protect the identity. She's from Sudan and she's mother of three and she's in desperate need of work. So Aisha was promised a highly paying job in Europe by a broker. Because she wanted to provide a decent future to her kids, she took plunge. She realized that instead of taking her to Europe, she was basically taken to Egypt and then she was forced into kidney donation. She refused categorically. But then she realized there was no way she could escape, and then she was emotionally manipulated that she has to do it for her children's sake. Then operation was performed on her without her consent because she was kept on sedatives on purpose. Now, after realizing this, Aisha reported this to one of her brokers. The brokers told her not to go to police. She still mustered courage, went to police, and police reported her back to brokers. So today, Aisha is basically living a life in fear. She is subjected to constant threats and intimidation by the broker and his associates. She was told that if she did not withdraw her statement, her children would bear the same consequences. So, in her own words, I am worried about what will happen to my children. I am worried the brokers will come and force my children to do the same. And this is our last story. This is story of Damilola. She's a 22-year-old girl. She hails from Nigeria. She lost her parents in a span of 4 months, and that actually made it very difficult for her to continue with her education unless she saves enough money to fund her education. So she was introduced to a local traveling agent who arranged her travel to Oman. Now, after reaching Oman with many other girls, she realized that African girls were fit to do only two jobs: Shangala, which in local Omani language means house help, and prostitution. Every single document that belonged to her was taken away, including her phone, her passport. Then she was sold to an Omani couple. And this Omani couple on the very first day told her in a very simple language that you are our property. We have bought you for 2 years and you don't own yourself until you finish the contract. Now her job description was horrible. As a maid, she had absolutely no time to rest. And furthermore, she became vulnerable to the idle man in the house. She was harassed sexually every single day the moment wife of this man went out to work. She was constantly molested by this employer and threatened that if she refused, she won't get paid. This ordeal continued every day, and she had no communication with external world by any means, but somehow she managed to save one old phone in her private garments, and then she used it to make 1 minute video clip of the sexual advances of her employer. So she took that video clip and she took it to the police. So instead of taking any action, she was sent back to her agent, who further threatened her. Now, Damilola is one of the few people who have actually succeeded in escaping such kind of situation because she had comparatively uh, well-off relatives in the US who could fund her ticket back home. Now, she acknowledges that this is a rare privilege as most of the girls in her situation are not even given money to buy food, let alone a return ticket to home. So, this is where we come. Ostensibly, these stories appear unrelated to one another, yet they are connected by a common thread. Now, be it Kasturi's story or Aisha's or Damilola's, they all represent illegal and inhumane treatment to human beings. That is the common thread, which is trafficking in persons. So, what is trafficking in persons? It is also called as human trafficking. It involves illegal transport of individuals by force, fraud, or coercion. So, let me also highlight how prevalent this issue has become. It takes in 25 million people in debt bondage and 15 million in forced marriage every year. International Labor Organization calls it the new form of slavery. And it is one of the most lucrative illicit industries in terms of business in the world. It earns approximately $150 billion a year. $150 billion. Now, this is just behind drug smuggling and weapon trafficking. So, this reveals its true extent. Modern slavery is by far the most profitable at any point in time of history. So, in plain words, human trafficking is purposeful transportation of an individual for exploitation. But what type of exploitations? So basically it revolves around sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and exploitation for organ removal. Now apparently the United Nations also divides human trafficking into three categories: sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and trafficking for removal of organs. The causes of human trafficking, they stems from adverse circumstances in origin countries like religious persecution, political dissent, lack of employment opportunities, poverty, war, and natural disaster. Globalization is another factor because it has shaped world's market for the transportation of illegal migrants. So we are here to discuss human trafficking or modern slavery in the context of WANA region. WANA stands for West Asia and North Africa. We can see the countries included in this region on this map. Now, some definitions also include Iran, Turkey, Somalia, Ethiopia. But what we see on this map is by and large uncontested. So if slavery is prevalent all throughout the globe, which it is, then what makes WANA region so special? So there are some striking peculiarities of WANA region. We shall see it one by one. The first one is statistical underrepresentation. Now, as per the Global Slavery Index report, modern slavery in Arab states, they are affected by substantial gaps in the data available. Now, typically, it's not possible to survey in those countries which are experiencing profound conflict, such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, South Sudan. Nevertheless, we would need statistics to determine gravity of the problem and place accountability. So the question is, what is the cause of this statistical underrepresentation? And one of the major causes is interpretation of religious text in Islam. Now, there is one scholar, Professor Bernard K. Freeman. According to him, out of 40 million people worldwide who are living in slavery today, almost 15 million live in Muslim world. And by Muslim world, what he means is Muslim majority countries and countries with large number of Muslim minorities. So that makes entire WANA region fall within this category. Now, in some of the Muslim majority countries where Islamic law is enforced, it is still possible to legally own another human being. And this is specifically applicable to young women living in a state of concubinage. In most of the other Muslim majority countries and in countries where Muslim minorities of large extent exist, although slavery is abolished by law, yet conditions equivalent to classical slavery or even worse continue to exist. Human beings are bought, sold, traded, gifted, inherited, sexually abused, forced or tricked into prostitution, massively exploited for labor, held in bondage for debt, forced into marriages, and they are made victims of organ trafficking by deceit, force, and fraud. So, according to Professor Freeman, Islamic law condemns all of these circumstances and practices. So, where is the problem? So, he notices that unfortunately there is no consensus of Islamic scholars condemning such kind of practices. Hence, he has launched his initiative, which is titled ICHRRRF on Slavery. It is the first of its kind online platform for Muslim thinkers to reach an agreement that slavery must be abolished under Sharia. Second peculiarity of WANA region is that migrant workers outnumber local workers. So in Gulf region, which constitutes major portion of WANA, migrant workers make up a large percentage of population. So for instance, in UAE and Qatar, they constitute around 90%. In Kuwait, this number is around 66%. In Saudi Arabia, it is around 33%. These workers have few rights in legal system, and a great majority work in very dangerous circumstances on huge construction sites. None of them are citizens of these Gulf nations, and there is absolutely no path to citizenship or even permanent residency for them. Now, social and legal discrimination against them is openly tolerated and it is widespread. They often end up in these kind of jobs owing to misleading advertisement in their home countries. So this causes them to pay either large sum of money or borrow such sum from the employment agencies so as to secure employment in Gulf. When they arrive, they realize that the base value of their wages in real terms, with that value, it would be nearly impossible to pay off any debt. This encourages their employer to withhold, delay, or simply not pay their wages, coercing them to work in that same profession for a long time and possibly for a lifetime. Now, another important factor here is migrant workers don't have the same rights to educate their children, change their employer, pursue education or any kind of training, or even enjoy leisure time or partake in any of the other pleasant amenities of life that other Gulf citizens take. uh, they take for granted. So it is also clearly a race-based system. Almost all migrant workers are either brown-skinned or even darker. Skin color is a marker of their low social status. The kafala regulation, which is prevalent in GCC countries and even in Lebanon, it binds the workers to the employer in the same way as the slaves are bound to their owners. So the country's most of the countries in WANA region, their domestic work sector is not well regulated, and that creates an imbalance of power, which is largely in favor of the employer. Another characteristic of WANA region is that most of the countries in WANA region, if not all, are marked by conflict. So just now we saw the list. Many of these countries in WANA are marked by high level of conflict prevalence. The conflict plays a role in compounding vulnerability to slavery. In conflict countries, economic extremities are high. So this emboldens organized crime groups. They are the prime drivers of human trafficking. Also in conflict countries, due to lack of law enforcement, punishment for misdeeds of migrant workers can be extreme because there is no or little regulation of domestic employment by the authorities. Last factor is there is lack of national transplant registry. Now why this is important? Because the lack of consolidated national transplant registry in most of the WANA country, it precludes the understanding of true extent of commercial organ transplant. This has made the illegal trafficking of human organs one of the least reported forms of trafficking worldwide, especially in WANA region. So after looking at these peculiarities of WANA region, let us come to the categories of trafficking. So there are three major categories: sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and trafficking for human organ removal. So when we say human organ removal, 90% of the times it is being referred to kidney removal. These three categories do not operate in isolation. They are often intersectional. So for instance, victim of human trafficking for sexual and labor purposes from WANA, they are also at risk of facing further exploitation in the form of removal of their organs. So quickly we will see what these three categories are. So coming to the first category, which is trafficking for sex, this is the most prevalent form of human trafficking. Now, sex slavery involves males and females, both adults as well as children, and it constitutes 58% of all trafficking activities. It consists of different types of servitudes, which includes forced prostitution, pornography, child sex rings, sex-related occupations. Victims of sexual slavery are usually manipulated into believing that they are being relocated to work in legitimate form of employment. Some of them are usually forced to take drugs so as to continue working for longer hours. Damilola's story that we had seen in the beginning part of this presentation, this is an example of sex trafficking. In another example, Princess Amira, who was ex-wife of the Saudi prince Al-Walid bin Talal, she had spoken about Jeddah turning into slick slave market where underage children are being exploited for noisy sex parties. It also includes lot of drug and alcohol abuse. Amira mentions that one of the most disturbing things is that buying and renting of children, especially orphans from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Philippines, that is very prevalent here. These children become property of those who buy them and they are not allowed to leave without permission. Young girls are often divided into smaller groups and then they are further exploited. Second type is that of trafficking for labor. Now there are a number of different forms of modern involuntary servitude that can go easily unnoticed by general public. Debt bondage. That is a form of enslavement of people for unpaid debts, and it is one of the most common forms of contemporary forced labor. So similarly, contract slavery uses deceptive contracts to justify forced slavery. Majority of non-sex laborers are forced into domestic services, followed by construction, working in sweatshops, restaurants. If you remember Kasturi's story that we saw in the beginning of this presentation, it is a classic example of forced labor. In Qatar, which is preparing to host 2022 FIFA World Cup, More than 4,000 migrant workers are estimated to die in the workplace accidents before even the event takes place. No other construction project in the world even comes close to such kind of death rates. Even the ILO has issued a report showing an alarming high rate of death among otherwise healthy Nepali migrants who work particularly in Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait. And third and final form of trafficking is trafficking for organ removals. Now, there is global shortage in organs for ethical transplant. Now, this drives trafficking in organ removal. There is this Interpol report which was released in July 2021. It states that it is of particular concern, this illegal, uh, illegal transplant and trafficking of organs. It is of particular concern in North and West Africa, where impoverished communities and displaced populations are at greater risk of exploitation. In this region, organized crime groups, they recruit disadvantaged victims. This region also has an ecosystem for transplant tourism. So either in the context of transplants which are performed in this region with organs illegally sourced in the region, or transplants done somewhere else with illegally sourced organs from nationals who are situated in this region. If we could quickly go through how this trafficking happened, this trafficking in human organs, that is done in a framework of complex network, because you need a lot of people from local recruiter to victim donor to healthcare facilities to proper doctors who are involved in the process. Now, this network operates in three phases: recruitment, which is usually done online; negotiation, because this is illegal nature of transaction, so the price of organ is not fixed and it depends upon the negotiating capacity of both the parties; and then actual transplantation is done. So as a result, victim follows different levels of exploitation and are traded by brokers as a commodity until their organ is finally removed. Coming to the second last slide as to what is the impact of COVID-19. So pandemic has created new risks and challenges to the victims and survivors of human trafficking. It has also worsened the vulnerability of certain sections, especially women and children, who are usually trafficked. Now, coming to the last point, even if this is happening, why should it matter to us? So, if you remember Aisha from our initial story, the picture that you see on the left hand side shows her scar from the operation into which she was coerced into in Cairo. This is how her kidney was taken away. Second picture that you see is that of Damilola, 22-year-old girl who was exploited and molested in Oman. On the left hand side here, you see Kasturi with her right arm decapitated. Other picture that I have taken here is that of Sunday Elaborate. His story was covered by Time magazine. The scar that you see on his face was basically made by the Libyan trafficker as an identification mark. And this is the last picture. You can see migrant construction workers which are sleeping on the floor in Dubai. Picture was taken in 2012. This is happening on the same planet as that of ours. Issues underlying modern day slavery are uniquely tied to each one of us, regardless of which part of the world we are living in. See, the commodification of human life is the worst form of human rights violation. This is opposite to respect. This is opposite to dignity. This is opposite to the very concept of life. And global peace will remain elusive till modern slavery continues to exist on this planet. Now, concept of global peace, I meant to say, the concept of global peace might seem quite a lofty idea, but that has to be the ultimate benchmark if we have to build a world which is based on collective good for all. And it is an ideal worth fighting for. Hence, identifying, acknowledging, and eradicating modern slavery is collective responsibility of every conscious human being, so that leading a life with dignity is no more an elusive dream. On this note, I would like to end my presentation. These are some of the references that I have used. Dhanyavad.
Thank you very much indeed, Anushree, for presenting very detailed analysis of this problem and wide varying dimensions of the problem. I think as human rights researchers and activists, we cannot shy away from the problem. It is indeed a serious problem, and it's high time the world actually pays attention to this problem. Usually we have Professor Nanda, who gives 10 minutes comments as the chief mentor. I don't see that he is here today. I was wondering if Professor Pathak would like to give some comments before I move further in the program. Professor Pathak, please. Doesn't look like he's there. I don't see the picture. Okay, so we'll move on, and I'll give some comments as the faculty preceptor for this seminar. I have some slides of my own, so I will go to my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is the WANA region which Anushree talked about. And this WANA region typically has 20 countries in it. WANA is sometimes also called in international relations MENA, MENA. MENA stands for Middle East and North Africa, sorry. WANA and MENA are the same, but using the word WANA is much more geographically and politically correct because it's very difficult to define what is Middle East. And that has a kind of Western connotation. So the geographical location is West Asia and North Africa. Although there are 20 countries, but there are other issues. The 20 countries include Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, and UAE and Yemen. Out of those countries, only one is a true democracy. Rest are either autocracies or absolute monarchies, some kind of dictatorship, or pretend democracies, or what is called managed democracy. So country like Iran are not true democracy, they are pretend democracy or managed democracy. But what is more important to realize that besides these 20 states, there are non-state actors that are also indulging in human trafficking and modern slavery. The most prominent of them being ISIS. For a significant period of time, ISIS had a political control over large, swaths of transnational territories and was running like a state. Unfortunately, the states themselves are complicit in slavery because of the official kafala system, which Anushree talked about. Also, religious beliefs. And I will have to say that, we cannot be politically correct and condone just because it is part of the religious belief system. And yet it is wrong. There is definitely othering of minorities in a specific religion that is prevalent in WANA region because you are divided into two universes, believers and non-believers. The believers are called momins and non-believers are called kafirs. And in a state where the law is Sharia, kafirs or non-believers do not have any rights. And this is what Anushree you were talking about, peculiar situations. Pretty much except for Israel, all these countries have very defective legal systems. And even if you commit crime and police arrest you, you may not be prosecuted, or you may be prosecuted, and in the end you may still go scot-free even if you kill somebody, because the concept of blood money in that region, which means if you come from a rich family, you could pay the blood money to the family or survivors of the victim if you killed somebody, and you'll walk out. There are hundreds of thousands of persons in conditions of modern slavery and human trafficking, also abbreviated as MSHT, modern slavery and human trafficking, in the WANA region. So, as human rights researchers, we really need to be very objective and not whitewash the situation or not sweep it under the rug because it is politically incorrect to talk about deficiencies of a particular belief system. So, what is the definition of modern slavery? Anushree talked about it, about human trafficking. A person who is forced to work without pay other than barest subsistence, under threat of violence, who cannot walk away from this situation. And that traditionally happens in WANA region because of the kafala system. You cannot walk away from your employer. You are bonded to your employer under kafala system. Modern slavery is an umbrella term that refers to a wide range of exploitative labor practices, including forced labor. Usually, I'm not going to talk about the power dynamic because Anushree talked about it. Modern slavery connotes a number of things: forced labor, human trafficking, child labor, and begging. Now, that has not been talked about. Children are trafficked from Africa or other poor regions of the world and are forced to do begging as an organized crime. And more than begging, in some of the WANA countries, they are used as camel jockeys for camel races. Now, camel races are very, very just like horse racing is prevalent in pretty much all over the world, especially in the Western Europe and United States. In WANA region, the predominant sport is camel racing. And jockeys for the camel racing have to be very lightweight. So children are trafficked and they are starved so that they don't gain weight. Because if they gain weight, they become heavy and camel cannot run fast. They still have to have jockey and they don't prefer adult males or adult persons because of the weight, the camel cannot run fast. So these children are really, really abused and misused. Besides organized begging, sex trafficking, domestic servitude, bonded laborer, debt bondage, and organ trafficking, these are all parts of modern slavery. And human trafficking is defined legally by United Nations as trafficking in persons. That means recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threats or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, position of vulnerability, or of giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purposes of exploitation. And unfortunately, if you look at that, as slavery is officially and religiously allowable in WANA region, most of the countries of WANA region, it's a normative phenomenon. And that is what we should be talking about. Exploitation includes prostitution, other forms of sexual exploitation, all those things that Anushree has talked about. So coming to some statistics, in the year 2018, there were only 1,887 cases of human trafficking reported in Middle East to the United Nations. And if you look at 20 countries that I talked about in WANA region, you look at the statistics, 11 cases in one country, 18 cases. What is happening that these governments are becoming smart? They underreport the statistics. And actual numbers are much, much higher. Most of the detected victims are adults, while children represent between 5 to 8% of the victims. We've talked about some of these things. Each of these forms of trafficking represented 30% of detected victims in 2018, and most of them were for sexual exploitation, and 2/3 of the victims were for forced labor, were females actually. So females are actually particularly at risk for being trafficked. Although 1/3 of the detected victims are from the region in GCC countries, another third come from South and East Asia and Pacific, while 18% originate from East Africa. In other Middle Eastern countries outside the Gulf Cooperation Council, 41% of victims are from East Africa, 23% of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, an equal proportion from the local region itself. Now, there are several international, treaties and norms that exist defining various forms of human trafficking and mechanism to combat that. So there's a protocol to prevent, suppress, and punishment trafficking in persons, especially women and children. This is the most important one, and has clauses regarding criminalization of these practices. One of such actually, mechanism is Palermo Protocols, which was adopted by United Nations in year 2000 to supplement the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. The different forms of human trafficking are defined in 1934 Labor Convention, which is one of the 8 fundamental conventions of the ILO, the 1926 Slavery Convention, the 1949 UN Convention for Suppression of Trafficking in Person and Exploitation of the Prostitution. And one of the main human rights instruments, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, also acknowledges and prohibits various forms of human trafficking. I think sometimes we fudge over issues by using terminologies like modern slavery. So you see, from the inception of United Nations, ILO, they have tried to address this trafficking and slavery, forced labor, from the beginning. So there's nothing modern about it. These practices have percolated in the WANA region for a long period of time. And I'm going to make some, declaratory statements about it. When we say modern slavery, the connotation is that it is to be differentiated by slavery as practiced by European and America, United States in the Middle Ages, till slavery was outlawed in these European countries and United States. So that is to distinguish from that. But what is not realized that the slave trade from Africa to Europe and to United States was equally aided and abetted by countries that are present in the WANA region. They were equally implicit and complicit in the slave trade. That is what is not recognized. So there's nothing new about it. There's nothing modern about it. Slavery has persisted in WANA region or Middle East region and Northern Africa for a long period of time. People have just not opened their eyes, because if you look at historical details, you'll find that they were there. In fact, the word slave itself has very interesting etymological origin. The slave word comes from the word Slavic race, Slav. In the Middle Ages, European women, especially from the East Europe, the Slavic nations, were trafficked. So people in the WANA region or the Middle East will say, where is my Slav? And that my Slav female became my slave. So that is the linguistic etymological origin of word slave, which comes from Slav female who were trafficked. And there are paintings after paintings depicting nude Slavic women being displayed in Middle Eastern markets for sale and, traffic, commercial transactions. So I talked about non-state actors, and this exodus is of the Yazidi people. So when ISIS took control of northern Iraq, parts of Syria and other parts of WANA region, the most targeted people were the Yazidi people. There was systemic slavery of Yazidi people by the ISIS in Iraq in 2014 and onwards. ISIS fighters invaded the Shinjar region in northern Iraq, which is home to majority of the Yazidi population. Yazidis are different from the traditional Arab people. They are supposedly much more, Caucasian rather than Arabic race. Their language is different and their religion is much more distinct from Iraq's Sunni Islamic region. Yazidi religion is an ancient faith which is derivative of ancient Zoroastrianism as well as part of Hinduism. And they do believe in, worshipping the nature and worshipping a deity, which is forbidden in Sunni version of Islam and even for that matter in Shia version of Islam. And because of these different belief systems, Yazidis are considered so-called infidels or non-believers or kafirs by the ISIS. And they were considered, according to their religious doctrine, a fair game, because if you are the other party, you could be enslaved. At least that is what their religious text says so. So when ISIS fighters controlled Shinjar and adjoining areas, they captured Yazidi population, systematically divided them into three distinct groups. It was as organized as the Holocaust by the Nazis. The population was divided into three groups: men and boys who had achieved puberty, so they were considered adult, women and children, and the third group was boys in the age of 8 and 12. And these three groups had totally different outcomes. If men and boys converted to Islam, they could avoid execution and they could become ISIS captives. And they were forced to work, not forced to fight, but forced to work to, support the ISIS armies of guerrilla fighters. Yazidi women and girls were deemed as property of ISIS and were considered openly as slaves. They were sold in markets using social media. And the pictures were circulated for bidding wars on social media websites and platforms like Telegram. Once sold, Yazidi women and girls were used for sexual slavery, forced to work as domestic servants in the ISIS fighters' homes. So again, religiously sanctioned servitude and slavery. Around one-fifth of these females were contained in military-based holding sites, mainly for sexual exploitation purposes. You know, some of the East Asian countries still talk about Japanese exploitation of comfort women from Korea. But this is happening in 21st century. And the world did not say anything about it. Young children were transferred with their mother. When the mother was sold, a year-old child or 2-year-old child was sold along with the mother. And the last group, the boys between age and 12, they were considered potential recruits for the ISIS fighters because they could be indoctrinated and trained to become fighters. Their names would be changed, their religion would be changed forcibly, and they were chained basically as cannon fodders, as fighters for the ISIS after indoctrinating them. So there were different fates for all these three groups in a very systematic manner. So it tells you that the problem of slavery is endemic in this region. You know, there is no newness to it. It is part of the, culture which has been there for at least 1,000 years, if not more. I am very, very sorry to say that large, prominent human rights organizations have failed to do their duty and have failed to actually look at this problem in the WANA region. I think of late we have decided to be much more specific and region specific when we look at human rights violations, because when we have a global lecture, certain regions escape scrutiny. So in future seminars, we will be talking about actually specific regions of the world where problems of human rights violations are seen. So with those comments, I'm going to present, stop my own commentary, except for one. I have a video and I'm trying to actually put this video on. And let me see if I can do that, because it's a very interesting video. I'm not able to put this video, but I can send it later on to the participants. This video is from Al-Azhar University in Egypt. And this video clip is of a professor of Islamic law. This professor happens to be a female professor. And in the video, she is talking about how it is justified to own a slave. And actually, I'm going to run this video. You may not see the video, but you will have the sound.
كان نظاما قبل الإسلام مثل الجاهلية بس وكان تاجر التاجر في الحر في الحرة بيبيع فيه اللي بيسموه بيع الأحرار زي اللي بيحدث الآن بيع الأعضاء والنفسهم والكلام ده. لكن لما الإسلام جه نظمه لا يكون إلا عن طريق الحرب المشروعة بين المسلمين وبين أعدائهم. يعني لو إحنا حاربنا إسرائيل وإسرائيل متصلة بالأرض بل ومعتدية على البشر وعلى العقيدة، وطبعا إحنا بنتكلم إيه عن المستحيل، يعني مستحيل إن إحنا مبشرة بكده يعني، وليس مستحيلا على الله سبحانه وتعالى. فأصل الحرب من النساء هم مسلمين، بمعنى إن عشان تجنبهم بيصبحوا ملكا للجيش أو للجيش أو للمسلم يستمتع بهم كما يستمتع بزوجته. بعد بقى المتطبعين والمتشددين من الإسلام يقول لك واحدة من شرق آسيا وتبني إسرائيل غرفة تستمتع بها كملكا. هذا فقط، وهذا ادعاء يعني لا يقوم به الإسلام إطلاقا، لأن الإسلام إلا عندك وإلا مسلم. فإحنا نحن بالمشروع هو نتيجة الحرب ضد المسلمين، ضد اغتصاب الأرض، ضد العقيدة، ضد كما يفعل البعض الآن. هذا اعتداء على حدود الله واعتداء على نصوص الله في القرآن، وأرجو ألا نتأثر به إطلاقا.
Okay. So you guys saw what this female professor was saying, and
Dr. Adityanjee, I was not really able to hear any of that clearly. Could you just you know, give a synopsis of what she said?
so basically she was saying that if in a war between quote unquote Muslims and non-Muslims, a female is captured, she's legitimate slave of the Muslim commander, who by virtue of being the master can have sex with her, and it is legitimate to own such slaves. That is what she said. It was a two, in fact, she's saying that slavery came by in Islam and it gave some order to the slavery. I mean, so what she's trying to imply that prior to that, there were no rules and regulations in slavery, but Islam, when it came, gave some order and some norms. So if you capture a female in war against the infidels, it's okay, it's kosher to own her as a sex slave, and by the virtue of what your right hand possesses. But it is not okay to get a domestic sort of servant purchased from East Asia and then have sex with her. That is not according to the religious, kosher according to the religious belief system, but captured females in a war against infidels are a fair game to own and have sex with as slaves. Now, this is the concept of emancipation in that particular region of the world. And our elites have closed their eyes. Eyes are wide shut. This is 21st century. We had the war in Middle East region or WANA region. ISIS did capture Yazidis as female slaves. I think what has become that United Nations and all its instruments have become impotent under political correctness and under the concept of one country, one vote in United Nations. UN has become totally impotent as an organization that can enforce human rights laws. This is utter degradation of human persons, the way Yazidi women were treated. You know, when we talk about slavery, we just say, oh, slavery is no longer existent. It was there in Middle Ages and all European slave traders, but they were aided and abetted by, slave capturers and slave owners and slave traders in the WANA region. And the history of that has to be written properly, has not been written. There are just anecdotal references here and there in certain books and some paintings and pictures. But it is considered politically incorrect to talk about it because you are criticizing a particular religion. But you have to see the reality. You cannot actually close your eyes that this is happening to a population that was a civilian population living in a country. Country was invaded by ISIS fighters who actually captured the entire population, and different fates were, the men and boys beyond puberty were either killed or converted into domestic slaves if they changed their religion. Women and girls were used as prostitutes and sexual slaves, and young boys in the age of between 8 and 12, their names were changed, their identities were changed, they were forced to convert to Islam and trained as ISIS fighters. And that's the reality we are talking about. So we have time for Q&A now. We have the last hour there, last half, 30 minutes there. So does anyone have any questions? Let's see if there's any question in the chat function. Okay, let me read. So Professor Pathak says, very good presentation, lot of learning and new information. I need to drop out due to another call. That's the only comment we have here. Any other question by anyone else?
I have a question, Dr. This is
Go
Carl.
ahead.
Thank you both, Dr. Adityanjee as well as Sri for these presentations. Question that I had was, apart from the individuals and societies and groups and countries where slavery and a culture of slavery and exploitation and trafficking is endemic, I wanted to understand what is the legal responsibility of countries from which these slaves are sourced. We said that most of the slaves are sourced East Africa, Central Asia, and then South Asia. What is the responsibility of those states to protect their citizens, to stand up for them, or at least to warn their citizens and spread awareness that if you're going to take up this contract, this is what very well happened to you? what is their liability in this, and has anything been done to put pressure on those governments? Thank you.
Anushree, you had referred to it in your presentation. Do you want to give a detailed reply? You talked about Indonesia.
Yes, Adityanjee. During my research for this presentation topic, I came across this example. In fact, there were a lot of documented evidences of survivors and testimonies of survivors, which actually goes on to showcase how this phenomenon is rampant in Saudi Arabia, especially with respect to young girls from Southeast Asian countries and Indonesia. So there were a lot of testimonies of Indonesian survivors, and by 2011, Indonesian government had actually taken a stand that it would not allow its citizens to go into Saudi Arabia and work as domestic workers. Now, this precaution has been taken only for domestic workers, not subjected to any other profession. But given the gravity of situation where it is practically impossible for the working embassy and consulate in that country to uh, give protection to their own citizens, this was a kind of step taken by Indonesia, and it's not just Kasturi's case that we have seen. There are many such survivors in India and possibly in other South Asian countries which have implored their domestic governments to take similar steps, because what we have seen here in terms of these few stories, this is just a tip of iceberg, and these are few lucky ones who have been somehow at least saved and brought back to their countries. There are many such people who have not even been able to come out of such situation. So increasingly governments, at least the Indian government, has taken steps to, I think it's not just Indian government, but a few more countries, I'm not able to recall names, that they have Indonesian government, they have come up with shelter homes in many Gulf countries, where they know preponderance of such cases is very high. So vis-a-vis legal responsibility, I believe this is what some of the countries are doing. They are coming up with that call number, which is like a very fast helpline where you can directly approach to certain people of the embassy in case you are experiencing a situation of distress. Other than that, I am not aware of any steps taken by any government to meet their legal responsibility.
Okay, thank you, Anushree, for expanding on that. I will add to that. There are three countries that took official stand. One was Indonesia, second was the Philippines, and third was Sri Lanka. And similar things happen. Stories, name change, stories change, but basically the women were promised jobs, they were taken, they were abused, all that sort of thing. In one case, I think it was Sri Lankan maid who murdered the employer or something like that, and then was to be executed. So these governments actually said that they will stop sending domestic workers to the WANA region. It's a very complex situation with poverty from the, you know, human exporting countries, human potential exporting countries or labor exporting countries. Then there are transnational gangs, especially in, Africa, there are transnational organized criminal gangs that traffic people, whether children, whether adults or something like that. And not only the governments, but people also are you know, in the need of money. And most of the countries in WANA region have, cash surplus because of the oil boom. So there is a differential power because of mercantile, processes and things like that. Should these governments be doing something much more? Yes. Some of the governments have tried to regulate the process of recruitment by foreign agents and all, and tried to involve actually government agencies into that. So I can tell you that at one point in time, people could be taken away from India without any this thing. And then the government started requiring a stamp on the passport before anybody who is recruited abroad, and it's called Protectorate of Immigrants stamp, so that they are registered duly. And in certain cases, the Indian government insisted with Saudi Arabia that there should be government to government recruitment. So not whole lot has been done by various countries. They are struggling themselves economically or otherwise. There's no common platform for that. Whereas WANA region is much more organized. You have, organizations like Gulf Cooperation Council or OIC and all that sort of thing. And they have the Islamic law in their favor because it allows othering of people into believers and non-believers, or Mu'mins or Kafirs, or believers and infidels. So it's a normative phenomenon for them. Should the international organizations be doing something more? Yes. There's an organization called Free the Slave. Free the Slave is an organization that is very much centered in the WANA region. And they are saying, in fact, Anushree also talked about that, you need to train moderate people and organizations in these countries about, changing the theological belief system that slavery is wrong, but it's unlikely to happen. It may be a very sort of, progressive attempt, but unless you really actually reform the religion, uh, it is still justified. And that's why I put up that particular video from Al Azhar University, that it was being justified that it's okay to capture females, slaves in a war situation, and humiliate them by forced sex and prostitution by the military fighters. And that's a woman professor saying that it's okay. I mean, look at the irony that she's justifying Islamic law as a progressive thing from previous practices, and she's blaming some people for misusing the Islamic law, that Islamic law does not permit other forms of sexual exploitation, but condones sexual slavery of captured female slaves. So we are dealing with a very complex problem, and any step, even a single step, is welcome from not taking any action at all. And it's incumbent upon all of us to open our voices, raise our voices in support of these survivors and the victims, because they have no one to speak about for them. So it is everyone's responsibility as an individual, as a person, as a citizen, and as an organization, as part of multitude of organizations, and not be caught out by the political correctness or woke philosophy that does not allow you to speak against a religion. Any more comments or questions? We are a small group. We don't have very many participants. So please feel free to ask questions. Christina, do you have any question or comment?
Nothing other than what I put in the chat tonight. Lots of detail, lots of education, a ton of emotional things to digest. And it's so deeply ingrained for so long that it's going to take generations to address.
Well, I would not be so pessimistic. I think we have to, just like after the Holocaust, people said never again. And at least in that particular country, there was a strong resolve. I think people have to make a firm resolve that female part of the humanity is not to be exploited and degraded anymore. And that resolve has to be conveyed to the lawmakers, to national governments. I'm glad that Carl was asking that, what the governments have done. So again, it is incumbent upon the individuals and citizens and civil society to bring it to the notice of the respective governments and respective international organizations and United Nations. The more we speak about it, the more we expose this as a real life problem in real time, some action would be taken. We cannot have nod, wink, wink situation that, yes, it's okay. These guys, Saudis have petrodollars, they are very rich, they can, support our projects or, donate to our political action committees and things like that. That attitude has to go away. Ripudaman, you have been silent. Any questions? Any questions, Ripudaman, or comments from you?
Audible, Ripudamanji.
Sorry, I was on mute. So no, Adityanjee, no questions. Yeah, it is. I was just listening calmly.
I think others have dropped out, so it's only 4 of us. Since there are no questions, we will end this seminar. This would be available on our YouTube channel as a resource material. And we have 2 more seminars in month of October by Anushree. But prior to those seminars, we have under Speaking Up series on October 1st, a lecture by Professor Sen Nie, which is about China's persecution of religious freedom, especially of a particular minority religion called Falun Gong. So I'll invite everyone to attend that particular lecture, October 1st, Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime. And with those comments, I will end this seminar. Thank you very much indeed. And hopefully we don't have to talk about this problem in future. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Namaskar. Namaskar, everyone.
Namaskar.